All right, today we're going to do something like this. It's a simple box, I know, and I've got an animating sphere around it, and it's changing colors and all this stuff. We're going to do this inside of Unity. I'm going to teach you how to do this. We're going to talk about prefabs, as we just discussed. We're going to talk about production and why we do it again. I'll probably go over some of those points again. And we're going to talk about basic animation stuff. You probably have had some of this, but I just want to touch base with the basics of it. If you have questions, I can show you how to do it in Max too, if it's a little bit cleaner inside of there. But for now, let's just do it inside of Unity. So I'm going to close this, turn that off. So let's talk about what I have here. Apparently I deleted the ground plane, so very interestingly. Okay, I'm just going to make a new one. Create 3D object plane. And then I'm going to set it to 0. I have no idea. For all I can understand is why Unity would ever make things not be 0, 0, 0. So I'm going to say 100 for this one, and 100 for this one, and 100 for this one, just so we have a plane. And then I'm going to drop that plane down, point, or just 5. Should be fine. Oops, -5. Okay, so we're going to do this from scratch because I want to talk about some of the stuff we're doing inside of here. To do that, I'm going to delete this all the way up to here. Like that. Maybe. It's not going to let me delete it, apparently. Oh, anyway. There's where my plane went. That explains a lot. I'm going to delete that anyway. Okay. We'll take this plane and we'll just make it a little bit bigger too. Let's do 100. I was going to do a reflection probe and all that stuff, but that's not the point. First thing I want to point out is this is the same file that we've been working on. But the deal is we don't always want to have our environments set up to test our art into. So a lot of times what we have is an art scene that we go and put our stuff into. And some companies I've worked at, we even have an art scene where we place everything after we're done with the correct lighting and all the stuff from the game, so we know what it looks like in generic light. That way, if somebody puts it in level and it doesn't work correctly, we have an example of how it's done right, and that means something's wrong with the level, and we know at least we can stop with the art in most cases. Sometimes you have to dig deeper. But anyway, what we're going to talk about today too is prefabs, because prefabs are super important. I talked a little bit about them, but the way you want to think about a prefab inside of Unity and what they call the same kind of thing inside of different engines. For example, they call it an instance inside of Unreal. But for Unity, we call it a prefab. And what a prefab is a box. It's the best way to describe it. It's kind of like a box in engineering and code. I think of it like a instance or something that holds information that we can reuse after this point and not have to redo it every time. And I can tell you history, and I did a little bit before about how fighting through the industry that we didn't used to have this stuff, and now it's awesome that we do. So since we're in production, the first thing we're going to do is import our models. I'm not going to import the model at this point just to get to the video, get through the actual new stuff. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and say create a 3D object. All right, so I've got a 3D cube in here, and of course I want to set it to 0. And of course then it's in the ground plane because the plane should be at 0, 0, 0 anyway. Again, I'm not sure why Unity would ever make its own objects or things when you drag into the scene out at 0, 0, 0, but they don't. Come back to this cube. And we're going to change the scale of this cube to 10 by 10 by 10. And then that means that it's going to be off the ground because it's cutting it in half because the center of the cube. It's not like the ones we make where we put the fib at the bottom. It's going to put it at the top. So we need to have this off the ground by 5 because the center of the cube is 5, halfway through. Okay, so now we've got our cube and our plane. So what a prefab does and how you make them is pretty interesting. And we'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to get rid of some of this other stuff too here real quick. I want to leave that. These. Leave that one on. Okay, so what we're looking at here is just a cube, and this is, you can tell this is an asset in the engine, and what they actually call it is a game object when it's in here, and you'll notice that you can't find it, since I made it in the game, anywhere inside of your geo or materials or anything inside of the hierarchy or the project folder. It's only showing up in the hierarchy. If you bring stuff in, which most of you will, that won't happen, but in this case it does. So if this was something I grabbed off of here, it'd be the same thing. As soon as I put it on the stage, it becomes a game object. Now, a game object gives you the ability to obviously change some of the settings inside of here and define your object in its own way. The reason we set everything to 0, 0, 0 is because if we don't, then it will not import at the same point for everybody who ever uses it. And again, this is about working as a team. So we make our pivot points and our positioning perfect. Like with our sword, we put it at the handle, because if we ever want to have a character hold it, we'd really want the pivot point, the attach point, to be at the handle. That's the really best example I can think of. But so we talked about this cube, which is still a game object. It's just not available anywhere else. What we want to do is have some settings on this cube that we propagate through everywhere. Now, it's just a cube, so we may not have a lot, but what a prefab allows us to do is make these really hard changes for the object and then not have to make them again. It's pretty cool. It's awesome. I have been working in an older engine before, and where I have to not only build a door for a scene, and I need to have it a separate object because it can open or close, but I also have to place that door, and every part of that door is a separate object into each door that needs to go there. And if I wanted to have two sets of the door, like one where it's opening and one where it's just closed, it means I would have to put each of in every one of those door objects in each and every door frame. Whereas if it's a prefab and I had two states, I could just say, hey, put it in the game and with the open and closed versions, and one thing, I snap it to the right points. I know exactly where it fits. We have it all calculated out, and we know the door frame fits perfectly. And then all I have to do is say engineering. If you want it to be off, then you use this line of code or whatever. They code it so it turns it on or off, or engineers or designers would script it. Anyway, makes our lives a lot easier, so we don't have to drop two assets to every place. And it can get even more onerous as we add more and more to it. Think of a character and how many parts it has. If you think of it as a kind of a prefab where it has all these pieces inside of it, that's the same thing. Or a windmill, if I wanted to have a windmill with rotating blades, I'd have to have a place that put it and bring the windmill blades every time. And what if I wanted them different and all this stuff? So how do you make a prefab out of an object, whether it's a game object? You have to start with a game object, I should say. So even if you import a mesh and drop it in here, it's still going to be a game object before you can make it a prefab, at least the way that most of us do it. And what I also had you do when you made this art folder is make a prefab folder. And if you didn't, just go ahead and make a prefab folder. Really, it's super simple. All you do is you drag it into here. And as soon as you do that, you'll see it turns into a white cube or a blue cube. And that's different. If we go back to our geo, the cube, well, if it was in here, would still be here. It'd be a regular cube. You'd look at it and you'd see that this is the geo cube, whereas it's different from a prefab cube. And they keep changing the icons. So this is the cube for the prefab. Now, the prefab automatically has the normal look to it. It doesn't look like there's anything to it. The way I've heard it described another way is it's a box with a wrapper or something on it. It's basically holding all the information. And if you want to edit it, you can edit it here, but then you have to force it to update all the versions. So usually what we do is after we get our prefab all defined, we come inside of here and we do our edit. So let's say I wanted it to not be 10 by 10. Let's say I wanted it to be, let's say 12 on this way. Or let's say better yet, let's go to 8. So it's a little bit different. You'll see that it's set to autosave, and every time I make a change, it's going to save it for me. Now, when I back out, it's going to be that way. And now, when I copy this cube from here anywhere, I don't have to reset the size to it anymore because they're always going to be that size. So, that's not the only thing you can do with prefabs. You can also add other prefabs or other objects to it. Like, I could come back to Geo, and if I had something small, I wonder how old this one is. I haven't looked at it. Let's see what this looks like. Let me move it over. It's purple, doesn't have any textures on it. It's a sword like you're going to use from your class. We'll just throw a simple reflective material that we're using for the other. So you'll notice these are all the same materials we're using in our place too. I'll explain to you how to make a scene in a second, but let's go ahead and add reflect to it. I'm just going to drag and drop it, make my life a little bit easier. So now I've got this reflect material, and if I look at it from the right direction, it, you know, is reflective and all that stuff. Okay. So there's not much to reflect is a big problem, and it's using the generic sky here. Okay. So I could take this and just drag it into the cube like that. And then if I look at this right here, you'll see that I have a cube and then nothing has changed. Well, that's because I didn't actually put it into the prefab. I just put it into the object. And so let me explain that here. Any object inside of your game, any game object can be what's called a parent object, basically, if you want to think of it that way. It's a little bit different. It's different than a prefab, but it's a parent object. So if I take this cube, this different cube, and I'm going to leave it where it is so I don't have to zero it out, and I'm going to drag this sword into this, and then I take this cube right here and I rotate it. It should rotate the other object with it. So this object is the parent, and this is the child of it. Now, a lot of people use parent objects or parent game objects as the master, and then when they make it to, let's say I'll take this and I'll put it into my prefab folder. Come on, open up. Okay, don't be that way. Take this cube and put it into my prefab folder. Now, if I look inside of this, it should have my cube as part of the prefab completely, so I can change it out, and you'll see it's all the way over here. And part of the reason this is a problem, if you do it this way, is because see how big this is? You'll see it's a 1 by 1 by 1. And see how small this one is? Because it's a 1 by 1 by 1, right? They don't match scale perfectly. So if I wanted to scale this up, say, and I came in here and did, let's say, 10 by 10 by 10, it now influenced the sword too. So that's why I don't like to use base objects or parent objects or any game objects as the master prefab if I'm going to set some other stuff inside of it. Because now if I go back out, you'll see I don't even see the sword, but this is the same size. It's because my sword is ginormous over here. So with this being the master, when I do anything to this, even inside the prefab, it's going to propagate it all the way through everything else. So I'm going to delete this one for now because that was the example I have, and then I'm going to come over to this cube one and delete it too, so we make sure we don't have that one confusing me. So what we do have is this object. So what do you do if you don't use this? And this is also true, we've been working with particles. This is also true with particles. I don't like having the top level of a particle system being a particle because, again, as you change the master, it can change the others. So if you have it clean in a way by having another object that is not actually part of the particles, then it's better. Now the big catch for that is you can't necessarily grab it and see the particles running. You have to do a little bit more work, but you know, that's good. You should be working on the particles anyway on their own. So if I come to this cube and I look, it's now that prefab, right? So that's good. I don't mind it being prefab, but probably what I would do is I'm going to take this and delete it, and I'll say yes. And you'll notice this turned red. That means it doesn't have a prefab. Even though it's supposed to be a prefab, it doesn't have anyone that matches it. So that's a problem. I could just take this and drag it back in here, and now it's the prefab again. But I really don't want this cube to be a prefab. I want it to be inside of a prefab like we were just talking about. So I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to say, actually, let me try something. I'm going to actually go in here and say create empty, and it makes this game object, and we're going to call this master cube. Like that. And then if I take this and I drag it into the master cube, and then I take the master cube and make a prefab, now we've got it back to blue. And you'll see it's not blue anymore because it's just the cube. It's not a prefab for the cube. The prefab is actually this. If we go inside the prefab, we will see the cube, master cube is in the right spot too, even though it's complaining about this, which is hilarious to me. I think you can just say unpack prefab, yeah, and now it's just the cube. So you can get it back to its standard self, and then it's still got the prefab with the cube inside of here, and we can just go back out. Oh, it does have this too. You can also see where you are in your nesting by this right here. You're in the scenes, master cube, you're inside of it. If I opened it up and clicked on this, and you know, since it's not another prefab, it's not going to go any deeper, but this is your breadcrumb to where you were from. Okay, so now I've got a master cube, and I can come in here freely, double click, just go to this arrow and click on it, and I can come in and say, okay, I want this cube to be however big I want it to be, so 9. And it's going to automatically save it, or let's make it tall. So let's go back to 10 for this one, and let's go to 20. So it's 20 there. Okay. Now it's going to stick into the ground. I'll have to fix that part. And the other thing I noticed is that my master thing didn't actually 0, 0, 0. So that's a problem too. Which means that this, if I change this, 0, 0, 0, it means it moves the cube, and if I go back out, the cube is going to be in a weird position now too, and you'll see that this still has this problem. So let's do this one more time. We're going to pull this out of the cube and say, okay, we're going to just open the prefab. This is the reason you want to try and organize this as much as you can before you go anywhere. And actually, let's just do it this way. We're going to right click on it and say unpack prefab. Okay, so now it's just a game object with a parent and a child. I'm going to take the cube out of the game object, so then I can come back over here to this. Select all, 0, tab 0, tab 0. Now it's back in the center, and you'll see it's right under the cube where we want it to be. And then I'm going to take this cube and put it back, take this cube and put it back in there, and now I've got the nested or the parented master cube, and then I can take this real quick and delete it. Say delete. It won't give me any problems because I'm not actually using it in the scene anymore because I unpacked it, and I'm going to throw it here. And now if I look inside of here, everything is zeroed out. So even if I change something now for either of these, it's not going to affect the, I don't have to worry about it, zeroing out. So that's why you always want to zero your stuff, is because you want to make sure they're always in the same position. Okay. So the next thing I really wanted to show you is doing that animation stuff. So this is a part 2 thing, and we'll keep getting into this. So I'm going to pause it right now, and we'll come back and we'll start doing the animation stuff for it.